Peter, when were you in Vietnam? What were the years?
62 to 1970. I was based there, and I spent every month there in those years.
Did you get in and out during that time? Did you get home?
No, I didn't. We'd get what they called R&R every 3 months to Bangkok or Hong Kong, but it was solid coverage from 62 to 70.
You had a reputation for being something less than a headquarters correspondent, as I recall. Let's talk about the environment in which you worked and obtained your stories. What was it like?
When I first got there in 1962, it was a little war. There were only 4,000 or 5,000 Americans in the whole country. Advisors, at that point in time, the South Vietnamese were fighting the war, and they did not encourage reporters to go out. I'm talking about 7 or 8 reporters in the country, American reporters, 2 with AP, 1 with the New York Times. They did not encourage us to go out, so we would literally drive around Vietnam looking for the war. We would get in I had a Common Gear small automobile, which I used for 3 years, and we would start in the morning in Saigon and take off for the Mekong Delta, or for the highlands, or for the coast, and literally look for the helicopters going overhead and drive in the direction of the helicopters down side roads, main roads, to villages where the war was taking place. We would know we were getting close. We'd hear the artillery. Then we'd start seeing wounded men on the sides of the streets and the sides of the roads, and then we'd get closer to the real fighting. So that's literally how we did it.
Your relationships with the military at that time, what were they?
2 levels of relationships. There was the high command, the generals commanding in Saigon and the colonels, who were very cautious about cooperating with us, because when I arrived in 62, the political ramifications of Vietnam were coming home. There was criticism of the President Ngo Dinh Diem, who was running the country.
When you speak of the generals, you're speaking of Vietnamese now.
No, I'm talking about Americans.
Americans?
There were several American generals there, even at that time, in the high command and running the advisory effort. They were reluctant to deal with us. General Paul D. Harkins was the senior advisor, at that point a 4-star general. He was reluctant to talk with us. When he did meet us occasionally, he would speak in totally unreal, optimistic terms. Our contacts then and to the end of the war were with the men in the field, with the advisors at the province level, with the American advisors with the Vietnamese units. We'd drive out, we'd sit, we'd talk to them, we'd go out on operations with them, and they gave us the reality of the war. We would go out once we got to an area of operations, there was no objection to us joining with the unit, so we'd sit around with the advisors, we'd walk out with the Vietnamese. Our contacts with the high command in Saigon were always difficult. As far as the Vietnamese government was concerned, they rarely had anything to do with the American press. They rarely gave interviews. They had the French sort of viewpoint that the less you talk to reporters, the better. And they rarely communicated, only through an occasional press conference.
I recall that I was in Vietnam in 1954, and I recall that the French regarded us then as part of the enemy, apparently. They certainly didn't welcome the press at all. That must have been handed right on down to the Vietnamese. You speak of a reluctance on the part of the American military to talk with you. Was that the beginning of an adversary relationship, or was there just a general distrust of the press? What was it?
It was interesting to me because I'd gotten to Asia in the late 50s, and I'd met people like Kais Beach of the Chicago Daily News, Pepper Martin, who was also writing for the news, and other reporters who'd been in World War II in Korea. And I'd noticed that they had excellent relations with the embassies, American embassies, and with American advisors in Laos and in Thailand, and they were getting along fine. It was a revelation to me to go to Saigon in 1962 and find that the young American reporters there had indeed an adversary relationship with the American authorities. It became very obvious. Why? Because the American aid programs were going very poorly in Vietnam. To go out of Saigon and into the field was to see failure. The failure of the Strategic Hamlet program, the failure of agricultural programs. And the embassy and the Saigon government did not want reports of failure. At that point, the U.S. had been in that country nearly 10 years trying to build up a strong anti-communist nation. They were failing. The Viet Cong guerrillas were gaining in strength. It was bad news. And they thought that would prefer that this bad news be concealed. It was interesting to me that most of the more conservative, or most of the American press that was covering Asia in those days, the old Asia hands, would prefer to represent the embassy viewpoint. These people in the American embassy were indeed their colleagues and buddies from World War II in Korea. So it was a dichotomy. You had Kai's Beach and others coming into Saigon. Joe Alsop would go to the embassy and would report positive stories on how things were going, supporting No Din Siem. Maggie Higgins, God bless her soul, supported the Siem government to the end and was very bitter that it was overthrown. They would come in at the Saigon level. We would see them at a bar, at a restaurant, but while they were at the embassy being briefed, we'd be driving around the countryside, talking to our advisors, going up the coast, going to the villages and seeing what was happening.
It sounds like you just described General MacArthur's headquarters, as I recall it. There was always the headquarters group, there was always a group in the field, and there were 2 points of view, apparently. And General MacArthur's communiques, as I recall, were wondrous to read to those of us who were out.
It's under those circumstances, and it's remarkable that the adversary relationship did develop to the degree it did in Vietnam, and the antagonism to the press. And it dismayed me to some degree that what we were writing and what we were analyzing as the war got bigger and bigger there were so many attempts to discredit it, because what we were writing was what was going on. And in fact, I've often said that at no point in all that war did I ever feel endangered by going to a field unit. I always went back to the units I'd covered. And if I'd been writing dispatches that were erroneous, untrue, or left-wing, I would have been endangered.
Yeah.
The man wouldn't have tolerated it. And I never had any problems about returning to units. And I could face the officers out there that I'd written about, and I could face the man that I'd written about without any real problem. I think that would be, in the final analysis, the true test is going back to see the people you've written about. And I think I've said after the Tet Offensive, in fact, pressure was off us because everyone realized the war was disastrous. And there was very little attempt to argue with what we were writing. Nixon, Kissinger did not argue with the press. They knew that drugs were coming in. They knew that there were mutinies. They knew that the Vietnamese were inadequate and corrupt. The point was how to somehow pull out of there intact, with national honor intact, and the pressure went off us after the Tet Offensive, after it was clear that the enterprise was doomed to failure.
Peter, when did the presence of the CIA begin to make itself known to you? I'm sure they were in there a long time before you got in there, but when were you really aware of their activities?
From the time I arrived in Southeast Asia in '57, I was aware of the CIA activities. I met CIA people in Thailand. I met CIA people in Laos. I had a little newspaper in Laos for a whole year in 1960, a weekly. And the wife of one of the deputy CIA station chief was my social editor. The press visiting Laos would congregate at one CIA operative's house regularly. In fact, he would check their dispatches for them. He'd correct them, add names, and these were New York Times reporters, London Daily Telegraph reporters, Time Newsweek. That surprised me, because I was stringing in those days for AP, UPI, and Reuters. So when the correspondents weren't there, I was working. It didn't occur to me to take my dispatches to the CIA. In those days, the Western press, not just the American, the British press, the Australian press, got along with intelligence organizations, whether it's MI5, CIA. We all knew what they were doing. The difference was we didn't write about the CIA. The CIA did not appear in our dispatches. It was understood that we don't mention the CIA. When I got to Vietnam, in fact, well aware of CIA operations across the border, clandestine operations along the coast. We didn't write about them, and it wasn't until '66 that the AP was even willing to allow us to write in print about the CIA. Up to that point, several of our reporters had mentioned CIA operations in stories, and they'd been edited out in New York on grounds of national security. Now, the AP allowed us full freedom to write about the politics of Vietnam, to write about the state of the war, to write about battles. But it took years for them to allow us to talk about the CIA, because it was understood in New York at our headquarters that the CIA was a secretive organization, that they operated under a special understanding with with the press and that their operations were secret. Eventually, we could write about them, but for much of the war, they didn't exist in print, even though they existed fully in our vision in the field.
Peter, I've talked with a couple of 2 or 3 former CIA men who speak almost boastfully about how they planted disinformation, they called it, with some of the correspondents in Vietnam. Were you aware of that?
Yes, I saw my colleagues' dispatches based on CIA information. And it's a free country, it's a free press. I let them go with these stories. I think Joe Alsop Jr., he was boasting in print about the CIA documentation he had. Many of his columns were based on pamphlets, studies from the CIA. He admitted it. Of course, the other factor was that a lot of reporters would use CIA information to fatten up their dispatches. There was a tendency in the press corps in Southeast Asia to believe everything the CIA said about anything because they were presumed to be accurate. They were presumed to have had all the sources. I never did buy that because I felt that the CIA sources were as vulnerable and as prone to bias as my own sources. And
do you think the credibility of the CIA today is as high as it was then? Do you think they could do that again with correspondents?
No, I think they peaked in the early days of the Vietnam War. I think they were totally credible in the late 50s and the early 60s, certainly with the reporters I knew in Vietnam. Today, I would think any information the CIA would try to peddle would be suspect for good reasons, because I think they're being politicized to a great degree, and I think very few newsmen would be willing to accept it. Now, I myself have had CIA briefings. I went to the Caribbean a few times, to Africa in the middle years of the 70s, and I would ask the CIA for a briefing. I'm perfectly happy to talk to the CIA and get their viewpoint on a situation, just as I would like a State Department viewpoint. And I think that input is good, but I see no reason to totally believe anything they say or to totally believe anything that anyone says.
I recall going to the Korean War after the end of World War II and later on into the Suez Crisis and elsewhere as a correspondent, and it seemed to me that it was the same old war wherever I went. And I'm wondering if you've had the same reaction. As a correspondent in combat, you've worked in Afghanistan, El Salvador, and elsewhere, I know. Does it strike you the same way? Is it the same old war?
I think the major difference between Vietnam and more recent wars is that in Vietnam, even though we had to buy our fatigue uniforms on the black market and get our steel helmets on the black market and get our boots from maybe the battlefield or whatever, we were not given uniforms. And we had only a generally vague relationship with the military, unlike previous wars. We did indeed go into battle in uniform. We went with these units. In Salvador, you wear white shirts or blue shirts. You certainly don't wear anything that looks like a military uniform. In the Middle East or anywhere else today, you do not dress up in anything that would suggest you're allied to any side or the other. The wars today, the press is in fact in a neutral role, and we go with huge banners saying reporter, periodista, whatever a reporter is in Arabic or any other language, and try to say that we are reporters, because that is important. I think because of Vietnam, we have won a credibility internationally that allows us into many areas. I think we're fully credible in much of the third world, partly because of Vietnam, where the press was perceived to be honest by revolutionary movements. In Vietnam, we were totally aligned with the American or Vietnamese forces. So, but today, neutrality is everything.
In the field in Vietnam, can you recall any particular incidents of how you got a story, how you got it out?
We got it down to getting stories out of Vietnam became a standard procedure. We had to rely on military transport when the American troops were there because they were in far distant places. The American Army covered the frontiers of Vietnam mainly. General Westmoreland's strategy was to send them into fire bases along the border to fight the North Vietnamese. He wanted to fight the North Vietnamese. One reason for the Tet Offensive was that the U.S. Army was at the borders looking for the North Vietnamese army, and the Viet Cong, the guerrillas, went right around them and went into the cities behind them. To get to these fire bases in the north, we had to rely totally on the military. So a particular day, we'd get up early in the morning, go to Tan Son Nhut Airport in Saigon, and hitch a ride on a C-130 transport or whatever, to Pleiku, Da Nang, or whatever. Then we would hitch a ride on a helicopter to go further into the U.S. unit to, say, brigade headquarters of the 4th Division. From there, another helicopter to a battalion, and then we'd be walking with them. We were allowed to go as far into war as we wanted to. With a battalion, we could go with a company, we could go with a platoon if we so desired. And that we did. Some of our photographers spent a week or 10 days with a unit, walking along with them, seeing what happened to them, taking pictures of their engagements and activities. And we as reporters probably would stay less, maybe 3 or 4 days, but we just went out and on a routine basis. They were long, hard days. We would get up early and stay with units, but it became a routine. The war became routine. It became systematic. It was no big thing to get up and fly out to the war and come back.
And your copy did not have to go through a censor when you got back, right?
There was no censorship whatsoever. The only requirement for the press corps in Vietnam was to adhere to military security, and that basically revolved around upcoming operations. They didn't want us to mention when an operation was about to start off, and secondly, when that operation started moving, they didn't want us to mention it until there was contact with the enemy, until they were actually fighting with the other side.
Well, let's go to the other side of the world, not all the way to the other side, but you were in Afghanistan not so long ago. How different was that?
To go to Afghanistan was to feel like the communist reporters must have felt with the Viet Cong in Vietnam. You know, Afghanistan for me was the mirror image of Vietnam. I went to Afghanistan on foot. I walked with guerrillas, poorly armed, who were going up and down mountain trails, avoiding highways, going through villages, living in caves. In the distance, there were Russian tanks, there were big trucks. Above us, there were helicopters and fighter bombers. The mirror image in Vietnam was for a person like Wilfred Burchett, the Australian left-wing writer, who would go with the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. And he has written about being on jungle trails and from hilltop positions watching the American fire bases and the trucks and the tanks, of being under helicopter fire and jet fighter fire, and being just with the resistance force. So that was, for me in Afghanistan, was to look at the war from a totally different perspective. What I was impressed with in Afghanistan was that the freedom of movement that the guerrillas had around that country, which is, of course, what the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese had around most of Vietnam through most of the war, freedom of movement.
Peter, what was going on in your own mind when you were out in the combat condition? Did you feel separated from those around you? Did you feel that you were a superior being out there? You know what I'm getting at. You could go home anytime you wanted to, right?
It was, I've often been asked, what is it like to cover a war and how dangerous it was? Of course, it's dangerous. Going into a combat zone, I always had the certainty that I could get out whenever I wanted to. I mean, being able to have that initiative, being able to determine how long you need to stay under fire, how long you need to be eating sea rations, how long you need to be wet and hurting, was a great consolation. I mean, I looked at these GIs who were in Vietnam, coming in innocently enough and having to stay in the field with sympathy. You know, to that degree, certainly I felt superior to it all. We would ride it in a helicopter and we could ride out anytime we liked. What was noticeable to me in going into combat zones was that the GIs didn't always welcome reporters, because they often resented the fact that we could have this luxury of arriving on the scene, seeing them in their misery, and getting out. Television in particular was guilty of brief views of the war. I mean, they made a habit of going to a combat zone for maybe 30 minutes or an hour, coming in at 10 a.m., getting out at 11, and sending their tape down. Now, they argued, justifiably enough, that the processing was required. They had heavy equipment, and that they had to transport their film over great distances, where we had the luxury of going to a headquarters and telephoning our dispatches in and sending our film down and radioing that. But sometimes, particularly with Marines, they were resentful. They'd say, you know, what are you guys doing here? You must be getting paid a lot of money, you know, for coming here, and you know, why do you take pictures of us? We're hurting. However, the officers and those running the battalions accepted our presence. They'd been ordered to put up with us. And after some time, after a few hours, a day or two, the GIs accepted us being there. But sometimes I was very uncomfortable coming in from Saigon, clean-shaven, with a clean uniform, and by degrees going in finally with a med evacuation helicopter to a company, an infantry company that had been under fire for 5 days. And you go in and there are 30 wounded men, and they're bleeding, there's dead lying around, and all these depressed, unhappy, angry faces of GIs who were frightened, who were just trying to get out of there but couldn't get out. And we would move around and we'd take still pictures and interviewing people. And I was always conscious we could get out. I was always surprised really at the forbearance of so many of these units to allow us in. And I attribute that simply to the fact that Americans are conditioned to information. Now they're conditioned to newspapers and television. It's unique in the world, America, that Americans respond to television and newspapers. It's the best country in the world to be a reporter. People talk to the press. Elsewhere in the world, and even in English-speaking countries, they're suspicious of us. So the GIs did accept us as being chroniclers, accurate enough chroniclers of what they were doing. The satisfaction would come later when you get back to a unit and some kid's mother had clipped from the local paper the story you had done on him and mentioned his name, and he'd say, hey, isn't that wonderful? So this was the satisfaction.
Did you ever get a rocket from your editors asking why you didn't have a story someone else had, or demanding more action reporting?
An aspect of the Vietnam War that is forgotten by many is that it was a most competitive place for newsmen. And it is suggested the press is some huge cabal in Indochina, you know, determined to destroy the American war effort. Actually, it was the contrary. It was extremely competitive from the beginning to the end. AP, we competed with UPI on a day-to-day basis. And if they had a headline that we didn't have, we'd get what they call a rocket, a message from home saying, UPI has battle at Plagerang. Where's ours? Yeah. For the photos, UPI has a napalm victim. Where's ours? That went on from the beginning of the war to the end of the war. In television, the networks, the competition was also very fierce. If NBC had footage, if not a battle of a particular scene, a story, refugees, political, if NBC had it and CBS didn't, then the rockets would flow. Extremely competitive in the field. I reached the point during the war where I would go to a fire base where there were other reporters, and I would hide behind the latrine or sneak onto a helicopter from the other side so my colleagues wouldn't see me. Now we're talking about going into battles. We're talking about going into where mortar rounds are coming and where people are dying, and we were competing with each other to avoid each other so we could sneak in first. And when we got in there, you know, hiding behind trees so your colleague who's came in a different helicopter goes in another direction. I don't think this competition was overly bizarre or wrong. I think that was part of the makeup of the American press, and I don't think we distorted because of it. It challenged us to go even further into the war. I think there were 65, 66 newsmen killed in Indochina going out to get the story, and I think that while loss of life is unfortunate, that is the price the press had to pay then to get the facts back to the American public. I think the American press will do it again. Of course, amongst those newsmen, there were lots of Japanese, Australian, English, French, Vietnamese, who also died. But during the Vietnam War, I was often asked, why do you do it? But I was saying at the time that some stories you have to risk death to get. Some people laughed. They said, how could you risk your life getting a story? But that is the fact of war correspondence. Today, West Beirut, Salvador, reporters are dying, thank God, and not such a large number. In Salvador, they're dying at large. But we have to risk our lives. Adding to the risk is the competition, the real competition for information. But that's what makes the American news world tick. So in Vietnam, there was that competition. And that's what often pushed us into combat and into the combat situations to a degree which, in retrospect, is remarkable, I suppose, maybe seemingly foolish. But I think the overall impact of that reporting, did come to terms with what was really happening, and the truth, I think, did out.
Peter, did you ever get any criticism because you were writing what appeared to be a negative report on the war? Or did you think that you were too negative, telling about the killing, the defeats that were occurring? Did you have your, let's say, patriotism brought into question by the military authorities?
When the Marines first arrived in Vietnam at Da Nang, I watched them come across the beaches, and I remember being sympathetic about them. I just thought, these guys are coming into something they're just not going to understand. Because at that point, in March of '65, I'd been in Vietnam 3 years. I'd been out with the South Vietnamese. I'd seen how frustrated they had been in going through the jungle, climbing the mountains, trying to tangle with the unseen enemy, the Viet Cong, who were very adept at guerrilla fighting, who had been killing lots of South Vietnamese. And as the Marines came in, I thought, these guys just don't know what they're getting into. And within a few weeks, we could see it. They were going out into village operations. In the first American units that came into Vietnam, there'd be as many as 30 to 50 newsmen with a company of 100 men. I mean, we sometimes outnumbered units that we were with. You had some television cameras, print, and reporters, large numbers. When I went out with the 173rd Airborne Brigade soldiers who came into an area north of Saigon in '65, I saw that going through the jungle, they'd be holding hands so they wouldn't lose each other in the thick forest there. You don't fight a war by going through a jungle holding hands, but they were doing it because to not hold hands would be to lose contact. That is how difficult it was. That's how difficult it was going to be. So from the beginning, I had a sympathetic feel for the role of the GI, and I suppose throughout my war coverage, I would prefer to go out with the units and write about what these men were going through. There was the other factor, too, that to me, the whole dynamic of the war was how effective the American soldier would be in Vietnam. If he could really stand up to the strain, could he, on a man-to-man basis, fight this guerrilla who was out there in the jungle? Really, how were they one-on-one to each other? By that time, I'd been there for several years, as I said. I figured out the dynamic that, war is to find the other guy and attempt to kill him. So I watched that evolve. The early American units were enthusiastic. We would go out with platoons of all volunteers. There'd be black men, there'd be Puerto Ricans. I remember sit down and I'd tape record their reactions. And they would talk about how difficult it was, but they really believed that they were there for a patriotic cause, 65, 66. They believed. By 67, it was a different scene, because by 67, I was seeing battlefields where there had been many as 50 to 60 to 70 dead Americans on a battlefield, where their body bags were filled with people. By 67 also, the authorities, General William Westmoreland, the commander, was complaining to our editors that our reporting, by going out into the field, by quoting GIs, was giving an incorrect aspect of the war, because General Westmoreland argued that the GI doesn't know what's happening out there. He doesn't know the big picture. By 1967, when 20,000 Americans had died in the war, and there was a great debate in the United States, the press, we were faced with President Johnson and the administration declaring the war was going well, that objectives were being met, whereas we in Vietnam, certainly us reporters in the field, could see that this was not the case. The U.S. Army was not reaching its objectives. It was failing in the mission of clearing the country of North Vietnamese. And I personally felt that being there with the Associated Press, having by that time won the Pulitzer Prize, my dispatches having been published all over the United States, I felt a personal responsibility by '67 in communicating back to the readers of the AP and to all of the United States or the world the truth of what was going on as I saw it. By then, I believed that by going out with the troops, by going around the countryside, and by going with unit after unit after unit, and watching their morale and their activities and their strategy from the strategy of the division commander out there down to the reaction of the GI, I felt this was the integral reality of the war, that only if out there the war was being won, or out there the accurate reflection of what was going on would in fact be the destiny of the American effort. To do this then, it meant building up momentum and covering the war. I was out probably 3 weeks out of every month. I was out in the field with units, whether they were Marines, with infantry, and going with them in their battlefields, and walking with them into action, and trying to determine their view of the war. This meant spending many long hours with them. It meant being endangered with them. The AP, our organization, lost 4 photographers killed during the war and 15 or 16 wounded. I fortunately wasn't wounded. There were men around me killed, and there were numerous near misses. How did I feel about this? At that point, at that point, I suppose it didn't matter to me. I was cautious. I'd learned how to be careful in the field. But at that point, it didn't really matter to me if my number was on a bullet, because I had seen so many other men die that it was incidental if it would happen to me. This didn't mean to say I didn't get scared in action, that it wasn't arduous, but I felt there was a greater purpose to what I was doing out there. So we continued, I, and not just me, others, would to go out and to be with the GI. And I think that the more we wrote about their suffering and the reality of what was going on, at least the American public was aware that the war was something more than what has been described as a conflict or a police action.
I'd like to hear how you feel about the Vietnam vet, considering your background in the war. Those here today who feel that they're misunderstood and unappreciated.
Part of the problem of the Vietnam vet, the problem of the Vietnam vet is that he is unappreciated. I think officially the military looked upon the Vietnam War as being a casual affair, that a GI would be there for only a year anyway, and that the impact upon his psyche probably wouldn't be too great. I kept hearing from American officers that in World War II they fought the whole war, and that it was basically a holiday trip to have a GI in for only a year. Not only was he there for only a year, he went on R&R to Bangkok or Hawaii. He got ice cream in the field occasionally. So therefore, what's he complaining about? This is easy. In fact, psychologically, for an 18 or 19-year-old American to go to Vietnam, it was terribly bruising. They were just separated from their family. They were meeting circumstances which are totally alien to them. They were living crudely. And by later in the war, they didn't believe. They couldn't understand what was going on. The main problem for the GI in Vietnam is that he knew he could not win the war. They kept going up the same hill and being thrown back. They kept taking casualties. They were being shot and killed. I've talked to many GIs who fantasized about the Viet Cong, these men who would spring ambushes from the trees and run away. I mean, there was no tangible enemy. They would go through the bushes, and not only were they not sure what they were fighting for, they didn't know what they were fighting against. Many GIs did not see a Viet Cong. They didn't see a North Vietnamese. They'd be in a fire base that at night would be attacked. Next morning there'd be 100 dead bodies in front of the wire of North Vietnamese. Where's everyone else? Or they would get ambushed from trees. And it was a totally frightening picture for them. And I'm afraid the military authorities didn't have any idea what the Vietnam War was about. They're not going to know about the next one either, because Vietnam has essentially been dropped from the curriculum at West Point. They don't teach counterinsurgency anymore, as though counterinsurgency doesn't work, so let's get back to conventional war. In Vietnam then, the GI was unprepared, and he was a lost soul floating around that country. As a reporter, I would go out and try to make contact with that lost soul. And that's what we did until finally the Americans left.